I consent.
Thank you.
That's great.
We just consented to being recorded, so just so you know.
That's my last one, so I am glad that today is Friday.
you kept the best one for last. Awesome. I know. I think Brian's probably going off because he didn't come prepared today. There you go.
And just I thought this was the invisible hat. Okay, so we are up recording. My name is Matthias Delvig. I'm going to hold this session, PulpCon, for our CLI design. And I will get a little bit help from David later. To start off, let me share a screen. So I believe you can all see this. This is about our CLI, which is named command line interface. It's a kind of user interface in my thinking. And the subtitle here is why it is worth to handcraft commands. So we will go over this quickly, and I hope we get some discussion later after a nice demo. There is obviously a problem, and the question is, why do we even need a CLI? And I have put up 3 answers here. The availability of a CLI has been seen as a showstopper for adopting Pulp 3 over Pulp 2 or other software maybe. The REST API we provide is rather hard to use by hand. And well, in the end, people keep asking, where's the CLI? Where's the CLI? So maybe that's reason enough to deliver. Next question, why is it such a problem? I mean, if it were easy, we probably already had one. So I think one important thing to keep in mind is that the target audience is a sysadmin and not a developer. And the REST API provides good building blocks for doing stuff, but it is focused on atomic operations. And therefore, I think the CLI should build around workflows. And one important thing, the CLI should be a user interface, the user being maybe an administrator at that point, but it should not be just another tool you need to script or program something around. The question has been, can't we just generate this? And this is going to the subtitle of this presentation. As it says in the name, the REST API is an application programmable interface. So I think generating something from there will likely not get something that is a good user interface because it's a programmable interface. One obvious thing is that the API cannot wait for tasks because it's limited to whatever timeout your HTTP requests have. But whenever we create something around that on the user side, like a CLI, we can wait for tasks. And another thing is the API cannot at least easily chain commands. And in the CLI, again, you can start a sync, you can wait it to finish, and you can immediately trigger the publish afterwards, as long as the shell you're starting the CLI in, it lives long enough. The next point is the REST API is built around UUIDs, or, well, we do whole URLs, but they involve UUIDs. And that's quite good for machines to read and to process, but not so nice for humans. And the last thing is a little more subtle, I think. The commands might have or might need assumptions about relationships between our models that are just not encoded in the generated API docs. for example, what is the natural key? What is the equivalent of a name for my specific resource? So let's get to the next point, which is the design here. On the one hand, we want a plugin structure because Pulp is a plugin, is a plugin heavy software. So probably our CLI commands should have the same plugin structure so that each of the plugin writers for content types or whatever plugin can provide the corresponding CLI commands here. This brings up an interesting question. How can we distribute the CLI? And there are, I think, 3 options we maybe need to discuss later. We can have one separate repository. This is what we do with the proof of concept at the moment, where we just put everything in one separate repository. The question here is, who needs to be able to merge stuff there? Do we want to invite all plugin writers to add code here? The next option is individual repositories for all plugins, which would mean we just double the number of repositories we already have, which I think is a nightmare to organize. And the last option I see is as a subdirectory in the corresponding plugin repositories, which means the CLI code is very close to the code that it's used to operate with. It has the same code owners, but it would mean that we distribute 2 packages from one repository, which we try to avoid up until today. The next question about design is, how do we want to talk to the API? And there are 2 options I see. One is using the bindings we already generate. The problem here is they need to match the installed version of the Pulp server. So with one installation of the CLI, it's hard to talk to different servers at the same time without keeping to reinstall all the packages. And I think the bindings as generated from the REST API specifications are rather unintuitive to use. The other option, which we can show later as part of our proof of concept, is using the API docs as provided by the server on the fly. We parse them and we assume that the operation IDs are once unique and second preserved across versions of Pulp. And with that, we hope that we can have one command that can talk to different versions of the Pulp server, including different versions of plugins installed there. The problem here is if there is an incompatibility between the CLI and the server, we don't get a conflict when trying to install any packages. So maybe we need to find a way to code around that or wait until there are actual problems to solve. Then we have a design question about how do we want our commands to look like. And the idea we came up with will look something like this. The program itself will be called Pulp, and we will need a few parameters to specify to which host we are talking to. They will maybe include username and password, or it will ask for a password then. And then we have core commands like status. And if we go to more details into the plugins, the command will roughly follow the plugin structure. So in that case, that would be Pulp as the command, container as the plugin, repositories as the kind of resource to work on, and then the last bit being the verb, what we want to do there. And another example here is Pulp dep remotes show name equals upstream 21. That would correspond to look up that certain remote and show me what is there. Then, it being a CLI, it would be very nice to have bash completion. I think there are facilities in Python Click to do this. And overall, we decided to use Click to build this CLI because it's really rather intuitive to add commands there. Yeah, the mission we try to follow with our proof of concept is we want a framework that is easy for plugin writers to contribute their subcommands. The framework may at some point provide some kind of object relational model to abstract the Pulp resources away from the REST calls, from the bare REST calls at least. We think the objects should be accessible via natural keys instead of UUIDs. And natural keys, you can basically think of the name usually, but in case of repository versions, it's the repository name and the version number. The framework should provide templates for common workflows so that plugin writers don't need to do too much copy and paste. Just say, yeah, I have that workflow adjusted to this class. Waiting for tasks to finish should be absolutely built in the lowest level of the framework so that plugin writers never think about tasks at all. And I think it would be beneficial to at least share the expertise with another project we have, which is called Pulp Squeezer, for Ansible modules that do a very similar, or that serve a very similar task. Yeah, that's my introduction here. Thank you for listening and keeping the questions for now. But before we do that, I want to hand over to David. I think he has prepared a small presentation or demo.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to attempt to demo our POC so far. This is a live demo, so. Our prayers are with you.
I hope you
Cool.
make the proper sacrifices.
Cool. All right. So we have a limited demo or POC. It's up in the Pulp org on GitHub. I'm just going to go through some commands. So the first command I'm going to start with is Pulp status. And this just hits the status endpoint. And you can see the response there is the same response from the status endpoint. The next workflow I'm going to go through is syncing a file repo. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a remote. And then the next thing I'm going to do is create a repo, and I'm going to give it my remote. You'll notice I can just reference it by name. So I've created my repository. Now I can sync my repository, and again, I can just use the name. And the CLI actually waits for the task. It polls, and then it waits until it's done. Now, if I check my versions for the repository, I can see that there are two versions here. The second version is the one it just created, where it synced down 3 files. You can also look at my task. Here you can see the lock, progress report that I completed. So that's syncing. The other workflow we have is artifact upload. So I'm just going to download the ISO and then upload it. And this will actually use the chunk upload API to chunk the upload. Actually create the artifact as well. No way on the task. Now I can just filter the artifacts by my SHA-256. I get back the artifact that I just uploaded. So that's basically it for the POC. We only support the file plugin right now, but you can check it out. You just basically clone the repository, and then I think pip install it, and then you can use Pulp.
That is awesome.
Yeah, that is really
Thank you
awesome.
very much. And thank you for all the work you put in there. Not only creating the demo.
Yep.
Were there any questions? I could talk about some of the, I guess, obstacles I see ahead with the CLI.
Yeah, I have a question about an obstacle. We have most plugins just have one type of remote and one type of repository, but some plugins have multiple types of each. And has any thought been given to how that will be specified on the CLI?
Yes.
In the CLI.
This click allows you to chain those commands into even more specification. And at the point where you are, let's say, at Pulp container repositories, you can add a -- type and then the type of the repository to use.
And would there be a default one then?
And well, at that point, it depends on the plugin writer, but for file, we have this. It doesn't make sense because we only have one type, but we have it for technology preview, and it is defaulting to the file repository there. Yeah.
Cool.
So I got a quick question for David or Matthias. As you were writing support for Pulp file, how hard is it for the plugin author to add these commands? How much work was that for you?
Right now, we have to find a way to dry up the code, I think. Right now, I guess you would just copy and paste the commands, but there might be some way where we can share commands across plugins or something like that. So that's one of the obstacles, actually, that I foresee, I think. It's making it easy for plugin writers to get started.
Yep.
Yeah. But you wrote almost all the file integration, and I think it was very fast.
Yeah, it did go fast. But like some of the things like parameters or like filters on endpoints, those are going to be a pain to, like, I skipped those. I didn't really add those. Some of those things will just be time consuming, I feel like, but there might be a way to handle that. I don't know.
And so then the other question I have is about the rendering of the output.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I noticed that there is a JSON renderer that takes the JSON that we get from the REST API and just, prints it out as it is appropriate. Have any thought been given to what the rendering should look like beyond the JSON output? Because the JSON output will be useful in some cases, and that should definitely be an option for users to have that. But I think users probably want something more readable.
At that point, it's almost the same answer as before. There is an option for how to format it, and it's set to JSON, and that's the only option at the moment. So internally, the answer from the server is actually parsed into a structure and then regenerated as JSON.
Yep.
Well, it's easy to, for example, put it to YAML. It would be more complicated if you want something like a formatted table or something like that. But
yeah,
yes, there is a code structure to provide this, I think.
Yeah, so there's also some plugins for table format, so I don't think it should be too hard, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's hard to decide what information is going into the table, not how to print the table.
Exactly.
Yeah,
because like any REST API, the results tend to be overwhelming because it's giving you all the information. But what I'm hearing is that as a plugin author who wants to build support in for this, I'm not going to have to do the parsing you just described. There's an entity that I get back when that command runs. And so, complicated or simple, I can decide what to do with the output. I don't have to go through and just say, well, I got JSON. That's all I can do is spit it back out at you. So that's cool. Is there support? And maybe this is just continue down this road. Is there support for being able to limit the field output? I know a lot of our API calls, you can specify which fields you care about. Is that something we could support kind of out of the box with this?
We could do it. We'd have to look at it, I think, and see how. But
yeah, it's one of the. So this is something that David, I think, mentioned, is that we have all these query parameters that let you filter things, and the fields is one of those parameters that we just haven't explored yet.
Cool.
So one of the questions I have is not every object in Pulp has a natural key, or if they do have a natural key, it could be complicated. Mm-hmm. So like artifacts don't have a natural key. That's maybe not such a big deal. But then like content, like we can't reference content maybe by name necessarily. So I'm not too sure what to do about that. That's an open question, I think.
When you say by name, for example, like an RPM package.
Yeah. Well, the RPM package is not too bad because I guess you have the package name.
And for the individual, you've got the Nevra. So it has a natural key. But if you're trying to look at the big C content, as opposed to the detailed entity that is a piece of content.
Like even file content is not, like file name is not unique. It's file name and a checksum. So how do you reference the file content?
Yeah, multi-key natural keys are very common.
And I think having the SHA-256 as the key for artifacts is okay.
Yeah.
Can you repeat that, please?
To reference artifacts using its SHA is okay, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think we need there's facilities for doing this, but we need to think about how to present that to the user. You know, like Daniel just pointed out in the chat, for example, Nevra is not sufficient because you might have the same RPM in multiple repos with different checksums, and those are different RPMs, even though they have the same Nevra. So there's some complicating factors here, but it feels like the machinery is available to solve them, even if we don't have an answer right this second.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so this is only a problem when you want to perform some kind of action with that content, because, you know, like searching for it, you can definitely find it and you'll get a list of multiple, right? And it will show you the different checksums that they have. But whenever it's time to say, like, add this RPM to a repository, then you have a problem.
Yeah.
However, if it's copy this RPM from this one repo to this other repo, then it's not as much of a problem.
Yeah. Like in my demo, I actually wanted to take the artifact and add it to the repository, but I had no way to do that because I didn't know how to reference file content.
Yep.
So it says actions on content that are a problem.
So in Pulp 2, one of the limitations we had was that you could only copy content from one repository to another. You could never take an orphaned piece of content that's not part of any repository and add it to a repo. And a limitation with the CLI here. Like our REST API allows it, but with the CLI, it's just practically impossible, I feel like, with what we're discussing now.
If we don't have a natural key of which to reference things by, I kind of think that the PK becomes its key, which is not a natural key, but
God. Dennis, can you? Can you explain a little bit why you think I have a piece of content that has a backing artifact that I've removed from all my repos, and I want to add that content to a repo. And I feel like I'm missing something about why I wouldn't just, why I wouldn't be able to find that content given what we've seen here.
The challenge is that if you don't, you would have to use its primary key, as Brian pointed out, to find it. If with the example of an RPM, there are two of them with the same Nevra but different checksums. Using the Nevra is not enough to be specific enough to select that RPM.
Sure.
And so you need to be able to specify a criteria that's specific enough that's gonna find that RPM. And as Brian pointed out, we could do that by having the user specify the PK, and perhaps that's what we'll have to expose. But I don't know that that's such a great user experience.
Yeah, or on the other hand, we add the checksum.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I actually see that we can have both. So reference by natural key or by PK.
Yeah.
I think that would even work.
Yeah.
Well, and you can look up the you could have an option to look up the orphans and filter it down until you find out the one you own and get, even if it's an artificial. Well, I mean, they'll have a PK, but if you wanted some artificial name that maybe meant something to the API.
Yeah, I agree that it's feasible, but I just want our users to have a great experience doing it. And so it's complicated from a command line. And that's why I'm glad we have a talk scheduled after this to talk about the UI.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is it's not that it's not possible. It's just figuring out a way to make it palatable is going to take some thought and some clever design work.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
And that may be the kind of thing where you don't necessarily have to, if that's a feature that's needed, it doesn't necessarily have to be like a very explicit, take this object with this PK and do this particular, method to it to put it to this location. You could just have a, move orphan that does some magic underneath that just makes things easier for users. You don't want to do that for everything, but for some of those weird cases.
That's true. I mean, we can do more. Thomas's comment here that if you've got the more complex workflows are in some sense hidden, as in the plugin writer has written a do this complicated thing command, then that abstracts the user away from having to know the low level specifics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, I guess one of my questions is with this style of API, the OC OpenShift is the first one that comes to mind. It gets to be pretty big once you start getting into, show me all the objects, show me all their schemas, show me all the places they can live, all of that kind of stuff. And that's very API centric, CRUD stuff basically. Is there a space for like a higher level command line tool for can't say a good example doesn't come to mind at the moment, but maybe moving a repo or retiring a repo or something. Seems like maybe there's some space for a higher level one, and part of that is what we were just talking about, but that also kind of shifts the level of abstraction between the two things. Sometimes I like to see that as separate commands. One where I'm being very explicit about what things are happening, and one where I'm kind of like, just do the thing, do approximately what we
Where you
DNF versus RPM.
I mean commands where you specify some kind of key, and as long as it's okay.
Yeah, or maybe import this artifact, move it to a repo, publish it,
Yeah.
and whatever.
Yeah.
But that's
where a whole workflow occurs with just one command.
Yeah,
And I
that's
think that's the whole goal here, is to add. I think the CLI needs to be very prescriptive, and it needs to have specific workflows that it supports, because the goal is to reduce the number of interactions that a user has to have with the system, and just capture the most common workflows that are useful.
Yeah, like the upload command, like you don't have to deal with uploads, the chunks, or anything like that you would normally have with the API. Like that's all abstracted away. The upload command I showed.
like, in some ways, I always like the idea of having one thing that's just super explicit, basically CRUD stuff, and one thing which is the slightly more abstract ones. So that, if I need to change this field on this orphaned thing, whatever, I can do it, even though there's certainly no reason for that to be the first option that come up. But then the kind of more day-to-day, higher level.
So what I'm
one thing that's very expressive, one thing that's very high level.
Yeah, like what I'm picturing with the repository create command is that you don't have to specify a remote, but you could specify a URL for that command right away, and you could specify like a relative path where you want it to be published, so that one command would not only create a repository, but it would create a remote, and it would create a distribution, so that the second command that you would give would be just synced. And whenever it syncs it, in that case, it already knows where to sync it from, and it knows where to distribute it. So it would create a publication also, and it would update that distribution with the publication. And so with just two commands, you've created a mirror of some upstream repo, and it's already available for your clients to consume.
Yeah, which from a user standpoint makes a ton of sense. And that how much of that logic do you want to only live in the client versus, basically defining workflows, and you want to build on a server? Well, no, because nobody wants to build a workflow engine.
Well, I think, Adrian, some of the workflow will probably get built into the server, because it is just so convenient.
That makes sense.
Yeah, some like the web UI can't call multiple endpoints without like possibly being interrupted by a closed browser. So I think some of the workflows have to be built into the server.
Yeah, and the same thing with the CLI, right? You mentioned, I think Matthias mentioned this, that as long as the terminal session is not, interrupted, doing things. But as soon as, if you're not using tmux or Screen, you get disconnected from that machine, that your workflow ended if it's not being handled on the server side.
Unless you're keeping some state on client side too.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions.
But even good connection.
Yeah, go ahead, Douglas.
So with regards to running it in Screen and tmux, that I mean, that's not the only reason why you can have a severed connection. You can have an internet connection go down. You can have a PC crash, any number of things. I think it would be quite important for the server not to be left in an inconsistent state because someone's workstation got powered down because of a patch cycle that occurred that day. But on the assumptions that are going to be made, one of the problems that I hit with Pulp 2 was writing. So most of the interaction with Pulp 2 is through our own CLI that we wrote to provision the repositories and create releases. And I wasn't able to use the Pulp admin command because one example was the publisher name was different to the assumed publisher name by the CLI. What will we do with Pulp 3 to try and facilitate that? Is there anything that we can do to make sure anyone that's going to heavily leverage the API but then want to be able to use a CLI for certain convenience elements?
Yeah, so I worked on Catello before Pulp, and Catello uses different name conventions, so I ran into the same problem a lot. So I have two solutions. The first is not to use naming conventions to attach objects to each other. And the second is we build small commands alongside more complex workflow commands, so you can use either or.
Yeah, the goal is to be able to execute all the basic commands for each resource with the CLI also, and not just the full workflows.
Well,
I think that's where
that sounds great, but I would say the goal a little differently, or maybe it's just a different goal. We want the CLI to be able to be paired with any other custom tooling. And so when your custom tooling goes awry, or you need that one last little bit, the CLI can be used to augment it.
Yeah, which is, that's a good example that seems to happen in everything in the real world.
Yeah. And I want to come back to another thing you said. I think it was Douglas. The server should be in a consistent state after each REST command. So it may not be in the state you expect it to be, but it should. The CLI should just not be able to get the server in an inconsistent state by using the REST API or any other tool using the REST API. I think that's a completely different goal.
Because each command to the REST API is atomic. So once it's submitted, it, unless the server itself crashes, which is completely different.
Exactly. Yeah. And if it triggers a task, then the task needs to keep this atomicity or at least the consistency there.
So one of the things to think about based on this conversation is these higher level workflow commands where at the CLI I'm issuing one line and it might devolve into 10 API calls, is think about how to record in the background of the CLI. I was given this thing to do. It's going to take this many steps, and here's how far I've gotten so far. So that when that machine goes down at step 5 of the 10 and falls over, and then we reboot and I go back into the CLI, it'd be really cool if the user could see, you issued this command and it's not complete yet. So the server's in a consistent state, but then Matthias, as you say, it's not what I expect it to be. It'd be really nice to be able to say, okay, finish that job and have it do the rest of the commands.
That sounds a bit more like what you accomplish with an Ansible workflow.
Or even just stashing client side some state about what you're about to do, and kind of more of a, get rebase style, where it's tracking some information about where you are. You can resume or abort or whatever. You don't have to keep it all in one process or one shell or whatever.
So how would I got the sense, Matthias, from your response was that you didn't think that consistency would necessarily be appropriate for this CLI. If that were the case, an obvious example that I can think of is syncing an RPM remote, which can take an awful long time. I mean, you could look at a day and a half depending on your internet connection and the size of the remote. If the expectation is you can sync it, that will create a new publisher and the distributor will be updated to point to the new publisher. How would you deal with that in the event that there was a crash on the box? You restart your workstation and you want to see what's happening that sync process. Would you expect the CLI to be able to reattach, see the state of that task so it's still running, and then just start waiting? Or is there?
I think so. That's what we do in Pulp 2 right now. And I think that we would look to see what tasks there are associated with that repository and try to figure out if there is, that sync still running.
There is a subtle difference between 2 and 3, though, in that 2, please correct me if I'm wrong, but when you do the sync that kicks off a publish and or the effective publish and association with the distributor, that's all server side. So you submit one job and all of those child tasks are driven off of the server. Whereas in this instance, it's driven off of the workstation. And all of those child tasks are initiated by the CLI on completion of a task.
You're correct about
so that is true. You're correct about that. However, we are definitely planning to add the ability to chain all of that on the server side so that your initial command will specify that it wants a publication created and then wants a distribution updated so that whole workflow can be followed through one task.
Okay. Not expecting a commitment, but what sort of timeline is for that? Is that a 4 or is that in the 3?
No, like very soon. I already have a story written to do this in Pulp file. And once we get the first implementation in Pulp file, we're going to add that to the RPM plugin right after that. So I'm thinking probably within like Pulp Core 3.8 a timeline, something like that.
Yeah, we use it for the web UI, which we're working on.
Yeah. I expect. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so the reattach use case is very interesting. I think it might be not great if we have the CLI try to guess, maybe that's the right word, what the user would prefer to do.
That's what I said.
Yes.
No guessing.
And actually, so if the user says perform a sync, you make server-side calls to perform a sync. If the user wants to list tasks that are in the running state, then you show them those tasks. And possibly from that, you might have a reattach command or a show output or a monitor. Thank you. Yes, monitor. That way we don't guess and users can do what they want.
I think that would mean the CLI needs some state that is saved across a unscheduled reboot.
Why is that?
I mean, you say the CLI starts one task, and once that's finished, it would start the next task, but then something goes wrong.
No. I'm saying that.
No, that's a scenario.
Sorry.
For the reattach, it's like you start a task, and then once that task is finished, the CLI would start the next task, like sync publish or.
No, I'm saying, like, don't think the use case I'm talking about isn't the one where there are two tasks even involved. I'm saying just imagine one task, the sync, that takes a really long time, and the user doesn't have screen running, or they forgot to run it, or they don't have a long running TTY. and so they Control C it, but they know it's still running, and they come back an hour later and they want to show it again. So
I think we already have that.
yeah, I think that it shows the state of the task. Yeah, and maybe that's all it needs to do. Perhaps that is all it needs to do, because I did see this task state earlier.
You wouldn't rerun with the current implementation. You wouldn't rerun the first command, but you would it would output which task it started, and you could attach to that task with the Pulp task command.
And I think that would be better than what we did in Pulp 2, which was look for running tasks and then just reattach.
Yeah, and in a case like that, like maybe I want to deattach from that task that's going to take 4 hours, and just client side, I just sort of I have a session where I started this task, and when I come back to it, maybe I just say, presume, show me which task I had, and it's like, task number 1 was this, and I go, okay, resume that task, or monitor that task again and show me what its status is now.
Yeah,
not necessarily having to keep track of the URL externally or whatever.
Yeah, I think right now the reattach use case, all it will do is show you the task state, and so listing a task is no different. Perhaps if you monitoring would, I think, feel different if there was like progress bars. If it was showing you progress in an interactive, visually updating way, that would be meaningfully different than just showing the state of the task, which for now I actually think is really great and probably maybe all you need. The other stuff is just kind of pretty to look at.
Yeah,
I think
check, every time your attention span reminds you to see if that task is finished, you can hit some of the progress report stuff and see, okay, it's a little further along. Yeah, that would be nice.
I think the only thing about the reattach was if there is a sequence driven on the CLI, so prior to the changes in 3.8, if there isn't a sequence driven by the CLI, then I'm far less fussed. If it's offloaded to the server and then the server deals with the consecutive execution of tasks, then all you need to do on the CLI is see the state of that initial task that you kicked off, and I'm assuming you would then see child tasks. I'm far less concerned about a reattachment if it's not done that way.
Yep. Yeah, and it's these use cases of the CLI or a UI that are driving us to make this change.
And that's my big takeaway from this is that we can't rely on the client to chain calls together. Shouldn't.
Yes, we can, but we shouldn't. Yes. I'm going to give a check here. It's 7 minutes till, and there's another interesting talk coming up.
Yes, the next talk is about the UI.
So yeah, let's stop the recording here.
Okay.
And reconvene in 7 minutes.
Yes. So one thing, this discussion has been great, and what I'm hoping for from all y'all community members that are here is, as this CLI sees first light and becomes available for core and file and RPM, and we start using it, is lots of user stories opened along the lines of, it'd be really cool if you could do the following kinds of things, and here's why. Because I suspect there's going to be a really rich back and forth between users, the CLI, back to the server on these higher level kinds of tasks we want to do. But we won't be able to know what will be useful, because like, I'm a developer, I'm used to doing everything one thing at a time. So I'm not going to get the more interesting cases.
You're used to using the REST API.
I am. It would be really cool and I'll open the user story for this, if as part of the CLI that you could set a switch so it spat out every API call it made as a way for people to learn what the API calls look like.
That was very handy in Pulp 2, the triple V, quadruple V, especially when it came to the god awful Mongo DB query syntax.
Oh
Tell us
man,
what
yeah.
you really think, Douglas.
That's how I learned them also, Douglas.
Me too.
Yeah. Anyway, this has been a great talk. I love it. I'm really looking forward to working on this.
So for something like that, like when you're getting back, some of these queries have hundreds of fields in them, and you want just that one field. Is this going to be a just use JKU, or is there going to be a mechanism for I guess continuing those? Yeah, I don't know if I have strong feelings about either, but I'm just curious. Like, especially if we start talking about trying to add here's this macro list of things to run.
Hmm. I don't think we have an answer to that, Adrian. I don't have an answer to that. That's for sure.
Neither do I. So
Again, thanks for the great discussion. See you in like 5 minutes.
Yep. Good deal.
Brian, do you use those hats at some, like from time to time anywhere?
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. You know,
Can you give an example?
yeah, you know, just like sitting around the house. Just, you know, maybe I'll be cooking dinner perhaps. No. There, Katie, you know, with the circus company, goes to so many events, and so I would often get like a +1 ticket, and I'd wear a lot of them there. So
The hat that you're wearing right now looks very flammable. I would not wear that while you're cooking.
It's just yeah. It is super flammable. And the other thing I've learned about hats over the years is that they can get really warm, and some of them are pretty uncomfortable. And if you're going to go out for a night, it's important to be comfortable. Because it's just stupid. But if a hat's really warm and it's like New Year's, then that's actually pretty great.
That's cool.
Right.
Though New Year's around here can be still pretty warm.
Yeah, it's
depending
true.
on the year.
It's true.
You got to bring the hats to Brno.
Yeah, I mean, we can do that. There are so many more.
So we're at 2 minutes. Yeah, so we're at 2 minutes after. Should we go ahead and begin?
Yeah, we should. Perfect.
I love it.
Thank you, Lai. All right, now we got to ask for consent before recording, guys.
Yes. In fact, I will do that now. Please let me know if you do not consent to recording. Why?
It's great.
Consent.
Perfect. Here we go. All right. This recording is live. Dennis, we're like co-leading this session. How do we want to do this?
I think so. I can share my screen. There isn't really a whole lot to share the screen for, but I will share my screen right now.
I put a link to the agenda in the live chat.
Cool. Is this big enough?
Yeah, it looks good to me, Dennis. And if I can read it, anybody should be able to.
Cool. All right. So during this session, we're going to talk about the importance of having a UI for Pulp. Pulp has never had a UI, and we have probably had less of an adoption of Pulp because of its lack of a UI. And right now we don't have a CLI either, and I know that we're working on one. And I really hope that we get a CLI because that meets the needs of a subset of our users. And in order for us to reach even more users, I think we will need a UI that will allow users to get started much more quickly with Pulp. There is a set of users that is already using our competitors' products, such as Artifactory or Nexus. And the really nice thing about both of those is that you can get started with both of those by going to a web UI, putting in a little bit of information, and you have your repositories being synced and published and available to your clients. Brian, do you want to add something?
Oh, you know me. Yes. One of the reasons why this session is important is because Pulp having a UI is somewhat of a controversial thing. And so we need to make sure that this is that its motivations are really on solid ground, that they're not just things that are perceived by some folks, but not actually matching an accurate fact-based reality. And also, one of the reasons why it's a sort of a line that the Pulp project has never crossed. We have always been a API-based only service. We have shipped a CLI, but we have always said, when asked when will Pulp have a UI, the answer is Pulp will not have a UI. It will always allow other projects to build a UI on top of it. But
our answer has been that Catello is our UI.
Catello is our UI. Yeah, that has been the answer. Now there's another UI. Galaxy NG is also a UI. But you're absolutely right about that, Dennis. Go on.
The biggest challenge with that answer, though, is that even though Catello is a UI, it's in order to deploy that UI, you have to bring some other technologies along with it, and it just complicates that deployment. And it comes with its own set of workflows and its own RBAC system, and it does not provide Pulp users enough flexibility to do things that they want to do with Pulp. And so a UI that's specifically designed for Pulp and exposing its flexibility will allow more users to experience Pulp in the way that Pulp was designed to be experienced.
Yep, and I think that what you're saying, Dennis, speaks to the heart of the challenge, which is that what I don't think we want to do is go through a great deal of effort to produce a UI that receives the same critiques that the existing UIs do, which just to sum all of them up into one simple statement, the UI is not restrictive or does not match my workflow. And this is why people don't want to use the existing UIs in many cases. And so, if there is the biggest risk around this, is that we'll end up with something that the same can be said true of this new UI. So, but I do believe that there is a way to get that right, and what Dennis said, I think, gets to the heart of the matter, which is that this would be a UI that centers around the Pulp feature set, whereas the others don't. They center around a specific workflow that UI wants users to do, and that's great for their users. I don't even feel negatively about that. I hope that's not perceived as negative, but that's the distinction between the two efforts. And I know that creating a successful UI is important, but also that it can be done and done well, because Artifactory and Nexus both seem to have done that. I haven't gone and played with their UIs because partly because I want to remain unbiased in terms of what that would be. I don't think we should just rush out and make something just like that. I don't think that would be. I don't believe that's the best way to identify the look, feel, and workflows of our UI. I think working with our user community, like we always do, is the best path to identifying a UI that's valuable to them.
I got just a question, because I see in the list that we are counting like there is CLI or the UI, and what about to join it? That's what the CLI, which we want, the UI that can be even easier to like thinking about the UI, because we will have some base for it.
Yeah, I think we definitely want both. Absolutely. And I think that the UI will be able to probably do even more than the CLI can. And not necessarily more, the same thing, but in an easier way. One of the things in our last session, we discussed with regard to the CLI is that it may be really cumbersome and difficult to specify a specific RPM that you want to add to a repository. Well, with a UI, you can present a user with, a table of RPMs, and they can check a box, or they can drag that RPM and add it to a repository without having to think about how to identify it. And the JavaScript on the page will know all the information about how to add that specific package to a repository. And so some interactions will be easier in a GUI.
I agree with all that. Also, Pavel, in terms of the idea, I like the question. In terms of the idea, how do these things work together? We absolutely do want both. I think just to reiterate that what Dennis had said, but I do believe that there is a unique opportunity to have the UI show you a CLI command that you can run. Like for instance, when you're browsing on this particular repository and you want to upload something to it, it knows the type of repository that it is, so it can know the client command that it can run, whether it's the Pulp CLI or whether it's, in the case of, like, for instance, Ansible, there's the Ansible CLI because it has a formal CLI, or other clients that have their own actual shipped CLI that pairs with that content type. And usually Pulp contains integrations that work with those CLIs. And so I think that's important, because if you have a UI and you've created your repository, say you want to pair it with your CI/CD system, what you need is an easy way to have a copy-paste command that you can put into your CI/CD script. And boom, that's how your CI/CD is now publishing into this thing that you can then come back and look at in the UI. And it's like, oh, look, I have all these new versions, new content from the CI/CD.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It would be nice to have.
yeah.
Nice.
Sorry, the direction of my question was about to reuse CLI if it will be first, that we can already use it, and vice versa. So I pretty like this idea. Thanks.
Yeah, and especially in comparison to something like, not to point any names, but OpenShift console, where, doing something in there and trying to, figure out the CLI to do that becomes a pretty obtuse reverse engineering effort. That seems kind of unfortunate.
Yeah,
Be nice to avoid that.
is never fun. Yep.
One of the things I wanted to call out is the relative priority between the CLI and the UI. This is a topic that has come up at a couple different points. And the CLI is absolutely the priority. The UI will be a much larger, much longer effort. It's going to be a many months it's going to take a life of its own, I'm sure. So the CLI, on the other hand, as you saw from our last session, if you saw it, has a great demo. It's come a long way for Pulp File. It's, I would say, in the middle game. It's more than just a design. It's code implemented, and now it comes down to extending it, the CLI that is, and broadening its command set, bringing all the content types into support, getting the CI running for it. So there's a lot to do, but it's absolutely going to be the priority ahead of the UI. And part of that, because the UI, I think, for the Pulp project, falls into the high reward but long-term interest. It's not like we got to get this done immediately. Because it falls into kind of that quadrant of planning, it's the kind of thing that I think motivates our strategy. And this is one of the things I wanted to talk about is we have a collaboration project with UMass, which I believe is University of Massachusetts, if I'm saying that correctly.
That's right, at Lowell.
At Lowell, which where some Pulp folks, Dennis and David, and I'm going to hand this over to y'all for a second, will be collaborating with a student team, which will be putting together kind of the first pass. I won't even call it a prototype. It should be functional for what it does, only it has a very limited feature set. So very limited scope, first start of a UI. And you guys want to speak some about give an update on that, maybe share the timeline and perhaps highlight the outline?
Sure, yeah. The project is going to be worked on by a group of students. They have a class, this is like a capstone project for these computer science students, and they will be completing the work over a course of 2 semesters. And what we've asked them to implement is a set of interfaces that will allow users to work with the file plugin. And we're hoping that they'll be able to move on to the RPM content type, but we really wanted to start with something simple, like we did when we were developing with Pulp 3. And we want the user, as a result, at the end of this project, to be able to monitor tasks. That's the first thing we're asking them to focus on, because Pulp is such an asynchronous system. We wanted a good UI, a component that's reusable throughout the UI for monitoring the tasks that are going on. Because whenever we do any sort of updates to repositories, remotes, all of that stuff is asynchronous and not just the sync and publish tasks. So users will be able to create repositories, list them, update them, and when a UI user will be creating a repository, they will be able to specify right away that they want this repository to sync from a particular URL, and they will be able to say that they want this repository distributed at a particular relative path in the content app. And we're being very, prescriptive with that workflow. But I believe that's going to make it the most useful for someone who wants to try out Pulp, is they want to be able to sync and publish a repository right away. And so then once they create a repository, they'll be able to sync it, and then they'll be able to take a look and see what content is present in the repository version that was created. And so I'm hoping that by the end of their semester, somewhere around April, at the end of the spring semester, we'll be able to demonstrate. Actually, the students will be doing a demonstration of this project. David, do you want to add anything?
I think you covered it all.
Cool. And
these 2 semesters, it's the fall semester that's roughly happening now, and then the spring semester.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's gonna take a little while for them to ramp up, so it might take a couple more months.
That's right.
And as I understand it, so you guys will be mentoring them, but also I believe the strategy.
You're all going to be helping.
Exactly. Yeah. Talk about the strategy.
The strategy is to introduce them to open source development and have them clearly communicate on our mailing lists what they're doing and the progress that they're making, and soliciting advice, feedback, and doing this on our mailing list, but also in our IRC channels, maybe the Matrix channel soon. And have them be part of our community and reach out to anyone, you know, on the team, not necessarily anybody in particular, but just feel comfortable to be an open source contributor that is working on the Pulp project. I think we do a good job of collaborating with folks that do want to contribute, and I hope that we can work with these students just like with any other contributors. And obviously, David and I will have, you know, designated times when we do meet with them to make sure that, you know, whatever specific needs that they have are being met. But in general, when it comes to asking questions about Pulp and so that they can reach out to the broader community.
Dennis, their CAP presentation at the end of this, that's also going to be like public invite, yes? Anybody from the community could attend when they present this?
I believe so, yeah, because what inspired me to write this proposal was a presentation that I saw from the spring semester that one of the teams did for the Foreman project. Right. And it was a great demo, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to share something similar. Yeah.
Very cool.
What did they work on for the Foreman project?
They created a tool that gives better insight into the in Foreman, and lets users drill down into them more than they can in Catello. And I believe that this was a new tool to keep things simple, as in so that they wouldn't have to learn all about Catello in order to do this work. And so this tool that they created connects to the Foreman server and uses the REST API to create an additional UI.
Cool.
And so the technologies that we're going to be using there are React and Patternfly, which is in line with other you know, open source projects making UIs these days.
And I see David Newswanger is on the call. Thank you for joining us, David. Dennis, David Newswanger, or David Davis, do you guys want to talk a little bit about the head start that the Galaxy and GUI has been helping out this effort with?
Well, I had a chance to talk to David Newswanger, who has put together a UI for Pulp for Galaxy NG, and he shared some important patterns that they developed in designing the UI that has helped keep the UI consistent with the state of the server. And we're definitely going to share that information with the students to make sure that they make use of that pattern. We also learned of some gaps in our REST API that would not allow a UI to interact with it. The main one being that you have to send basic auth credentials with every request right now, and there is no way to use a session token. And so we will be making those improvements very shortly. I'm not sure of very many components that can be reused, but I will definitely be looking to David Newswanger to give us advice as issues come up with just, getting ramped up on JavaScript and the pattern fly and React.
Yeah, I apologize. I missed the first half of this meeting. I was stuck in another meeting, but yeah, I'm happy to help however I can.
I just want to take a second, since you're on the call. I appreciate that so much, David, and the Pulp community I'm sure does too. If you haven't gotten a chance to try the very excellent Galaxy NG UI that the team has built, and I know David Newswanger's worked heavily on, along with a bunch of other folks, to try it out. I've messed with it a little bit, and I've also seen kind of a comprehensive demo of it, and it's really beautiful. And I think for the workflows that it's trying to accomplish, it does a really great job at doing just that. It's focused on the collection content type, so it's got a very deep focus in that particular area, and that's one of the differentiators around it. It goes really deep on that. It's purpose built for that content type, whereas this other thing will likely not be able to go as deep, certainly, and we'll try to cover, like 10, 15, 20 content types. And so it's just one of the big differentiators there. But really, David, I can't say enough good things about what you all have built, because that's how I feel about it. And I also really appreciate the collaboration. Without seeing such a great example, I would be a little bit more tentative about the Pulp team and the Pulp community's ability to kind of see this through. But I really believe it because I've seen it from y'all.
Well, thank you.
Is there a demo, David or Brian? Is there a demo or recording somewhere of the Galaxy NG UI? Or can we have David come to one of our team meetings and give us a 15-minute walkthrough?
I don't think we've done a comprehensive demo of everything, but I did a demo for some of our new features around content sync and repositories yesterday that I can provide a link to.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Also, and that would be great, David. Also, Melanie, myself, and David Newswanger, I believe you've seen a copy of it, and a few other folks too. We're working on, or really Melanie's leading, a article on somewhere, probably opensource.com, maybe elsewhere, which is designed to spread the word and information about the Galaxy NG plugin, and of course the UI is one of the central focuses of that article. So these kinds of demos and are exactly what we'll need to have recorded, along with some key screenshots to tell that story accurately. So more demos will be needed, David, is kind of what I'm trying to get at here.
Yeah, I'm happy to show it off whenever you want.
Cool. Other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, I would like to talk a bit about the motivations. I do agree that Pulp will benefit from the UI, and on no account am I trying to say otherwise or convince otherwise. However, I would like to step back and specifically process the feedback from the survey. If I'm not mistaken, and it might be possible, Melanie was mentioning that actually from the users' feedback, they're not that interested in UI.
That's our current users.
That's accurate. That's absolutely accurate.
My concern is that I wouldn't like us to invest a lot of time and resources into something which will basically not be popular or requested by the users.
Yeah, and so my biggest motivation is to be able to capture more users that don't necessarily feel comfortable working with just a CLI or just the REST API.
But for attracting more users, you have to make the current users happy.
Yes.
I guess there's a parallel goals. And I also think that with our community survey, we reach only certain subset of people. It was definitely like expressed so many times at multiple conferences, and people was reaching out asking for UI like hundreds of times. So it feels like with different ways of communication, we're reaching different groups of users. So I would be very cautious to 100% rely on community survey on this topic.
I'd also add something about the survey. I doubt I'm the only pedant that filled out the survey, and it's worded in such a way as lacking a UI, would that stop you from using Pulp or stop you from migrating? And no, it wouldn't. So I had to say no to the question, but that does not mean that I do not want or would not appreciate a UI. The survey is written in such a way that it doesn't highlight the difference between needing. I don't need it. The core element of how we will interact with it will be via the REST API, but most definitely it would be beneficial to have one. And I can think of umpteen reasons for that.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, I have my own personal take on it, but what I want to really focus on right now with my words is that there is a balance that we must keep in mind between not losing sight of our current value proposition and our road to improvement and our road to continue to serve our existing user base, and balance that against the goals of growing the user base and bringing in different types of users. And so this is something I want to keep thinking in mind, and I don't want to become too focused on either one of these goals. And if one of them begins to put the other one significantly at risk, we need to really be cognizant about, you know, what are we doing here in terms of creating value for the Pulp community as a whole. What I think that means, like, that all sounds great and everything, but what does that mean in practice? I think it means that the UI will be something that is developed slowly and over a long period of time, and we will try to pair our level of effort and investment in it along with the value that we see it creating in the community. And like most parts of our software, it requires an initial investment on our part. And I see that this UMass Lowell project as the kind of current level of investment spend, at least through April, for example. Meanwhile, other projects like the CLI, or aspects of the project like the CLI, will continue to go on as a definitely going to deliver. Let's make real progress on it.
Well said.
Yep.
We have a little bit of time left. There are some discussion questions on the agenda. This is really a time for us to just have open discussion. So, you know, I didn't write these points on here. So, would anyone feel like they would like to share a perspective or a concern or some other discussion point related to perhaps what I see around lines 30 through 33?
I stopped sharing my screen, but I hope you guys have the agenda.
I think 30 is just on the motivation and perceptions for a QE for Pulp document. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and I just put a link to this in the chat as well again.
Yeah, I think those are my my comments. Well, except for the routines. I'm not sure where that came from, but oh, that's the demo. I mean, part of it to me is with Pulp, there's so many resource types, and you know, the relations aren't necessarily obvious. So sometimes having, you know, we have open API schema and viewers, and you know, I have a Django admin that has a lot of the stuff, and I can, you know, dump SQL schema, et cetera, but actually seeing like the stuff like with real content filled in in a kind of easier way to like if I was looking at a Pulp UI and it actually had, you know, RPMs and Ansible collections and containers and files and all of those things, and I could poke through those and see what information's available and how, you know, how RPMs get organized into repositories and how collections get, you know, see that kind of stuff. To me, that would be save, you know, hours and hours of brain work to
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is that even though the REST API is great and like it's very powerful, you could be introduced to that REST API through a UI by having a visual representation of how things relate to each other and what belongs where. And then you could take that system and make more use of it through the REST API once you have that understanding.
Yeah, especially if it's real data for real things in there.
Yeah.
You know, we've talked about several times over the course of this week the goal of how can we make easy things easy and still make the difficult, complicated things possible for the user of Pulp. And there's often a fairly common flow of a new user. The UI is there, and they can see all these things that Adrian is talking about, and they're like, oh, okay, I think I grok that now. The CLI lets them work on those things at a workflow level. And then when their CI people come in or their really complicated development people come in and go, we need to do this really complicated thing, they can say, well, I've got this list of REST APIs that we can plug into our existing tooling. And so that flow is a very typical one of someone going from the neophyte user to the power user. And it feels like what I've seen this week from everyone involved in these efforts is that we're supporting that flow. Right? There's nothing that the UI is going to be able to do, for example, that the REST API doesn't have because the UI goes through the same REST API that everybody else does. And I'm actually excited about this whole process over the course of the next year, because I think we're going to learn things from the community that we have, and as we grow the community, in ways that will make the back end better, while giving more functionality to people to get them up to speed faster. So I'm 2 thumbs way up on both the CLI and the UI. I really like what I've heard this week.
Yeah, and your comment about the improving the backend API, some of the stuff in Galaxy NG is probably an example of, you know, sometimes there's, you know, there's just spots where we want to get data in a way that's not really practical, and the kind of the straightforward API, you know, it's this weird cross-cutting and, you know, whatever else, just for presenting it as a UI, because, you know, UIs never reflect sane, human-centric UIs never reflect sane data structures and organization, right? There's always that weird thing you have to do in the middle to make it. So there's some of that, and some of that could get probably, extended into core API endpoints. There's not a ton of stuff, but there's a few things. But that's just an exact existing example of the kind of things you were mentioning.
So we're at 10:41. I would like to us to consider adjourning a little bit early, and also perhaps starting our next session a little bit early. Our next session we've had a little bit of an agenda change. It was going to just be the closing ceremonies, and now it will be a few miscellaneous topics. We have at least 2 identified, which is Ubuntu support in the installer, and then caching related to the downtime discussions. And also, if there is still time, maybe sharing some perspectives around releasing Y releases with or without a delay for manual testing. And then after that, we will adjourn with the closing ceremonies brought to you by Rebecca Black and Friday. And so to do all that, I would like to hear if people are comfortable closing this now and then resuming at maybe 10:50 Eastern time, or that's about our normal break time.
Yeah, let's do that.
Any final comments before we end this video?
No, I say we cut it early so we have extra time for the airing of grievances.
Yes, the airing of grievances. Perfect.
As a traditional among our people.
All right, great. Thanks a bunch, everybody who joined the session and sharing the different perspectives on it, and Dennis for running it.
Very cool. See you all at 10.
Okay, see you all at 10.
Stop the record.
Yeah, I'll stop it now.
All right, now the airing of grievances starts. No.
Yes. What I really want to say, I'll still say on YouTube because that feed's still running. Hey,
All right, see you in a few. Nice hat, Brian.
Thanks. I figured this would
Save
be
the best for last.
yeah. I figured this would be a good one to close with.
So when you cut one head, there's like 3 other grow from it.
No, unfortunately, this is the cheap one from China, so they just get cut off. Hopefully, everyone will not turn to stone. Nice.
Did you just make that, Matthias?
Yes.
That is great.
I remember we used to do this
For painting the ceiling?
boats in childhood.
I remember this too. From my childhood.
Yeah, I think this is the kind of hat you wear when painting the ceiling.
Oh, that's funny. I've never painted a ceiling, but it makes sense.
You're lucky. I like painting walls, but I pretty much dislike painting ceilings. It's a pain.
Literally.
Yeah, gravity is, yeah. So are you ready?
Yeah, I think we should go into it. All right. I am gonna click the record button. Let's see.
I'm here.
Let me know if we should not. If you do not consent to recording, please speak now. All right, this is the last PulpCon session, and this is the. We're going to talk about a few miscellaneous topics, 3 of them in particular, and then we will have the closing ceremonies brought to you by Rebecca Black and Friday. The Ubuntu support in the installer is our first topic, and then we're going to talk about caching related to downtime discussions earlier, and then if there is still time, releasing Y releases without a delay for manual testing. And I'll put a link to the agenda here. This is a reuse of our miscellaneous topics conversation, and what we're going to do is pick up at line 80, and I will try to provide some sort of time checking along the way that we can make sure to get through all projects. I also want to, just before we get into our first topic, which is Ubuntu support in the installer, so whoever is the lead to discuss that, give it some thought to be ready. Just before we get into that, since this is our closing session, I want to call out now, and I'll do it again later, there is a HackMD for retrospectives on this event for the whole week. I'll put that link down here into the chat as well. So if you have thoughts or grievances to air, as we sometimes say, about the format or how this served or didn't serve your expectations or needs, or what you'd like to see done similarly or differently, or really any feedback at all, go ahead and put it on that HackMD, preferably today before we forget about it. and I'll bring this up again at the end of the call. So with that, let's move into our first miscellaneous topic, which is Ubuntu support and installer. Who would like to begin talking about that? I see Mike's hand. Mike, take it away.
Yep. So yeah, as I've maintained the installer over the last year and a half or so, I've noticed that looks like in the past we had Ubuntu support, but we've just like silently let that the code path, or even not so much code paths, just variables like rot. There's a strong justification for it that, you know, Ubuntu does have very large market share. Looks like in the web hosting market, it's like 38%. And having, you know, worked at or talked to other organizations in the past, some organizations, some sites, some shops are entirely just Ubuntu based. It is their standard OS. They don't want to install another OS in order for one server. They want to just keep everything on the same server OS. That's a common customer desirement or requirement.
Yep.
So I've noticed, you know, we do currently support Debian 10, partially thanks to Matthias and other developers. And Ubuntu 20.04 is released a little bit later, so if Debian 10 has dependencies, Ubuntu should have the dependencies we need as well. And that's why I estimate it'll be easy to implement. It'll be just another OS that's tested concurrently during the Pulp installer CI.
That's cool. So I made the assumption that since we are supporting Debian 10, that we're supporting Ubuntu. And that was a bad assumption.
Yeah, it's like we actually have to we can symlink the variables, and we'll probably have to do 1 or 2 more variable, 3 or 4 more variable changes or specific tasks.
Yeah.
But by default, it's not going to support Ubuntu as is. Symlinks the variable files.
I'm
yeah.
all for this.
So is the issues that are noted here with support for Pulp RPM on when you're running Pulp on Ubuntu, do we need to flatten them? Do we need to well, I mean, it's possible. It's just code, right? Do we need to flatten them before we do this? And I'm hearing that the answer to that is a firm no, but I want to ask that explicitly. Is it okay to say we support Ubuntu in the installer, and you can support all these different content types, but Pulp RPM isn't going to work because it relies on binary packages that don't work or don't work correctly under Ubuntu?
Yep. And I think that's okay because we do have Debian support already where you can install it on a Debian 10 system. And we provide Ubuntu and Debian content type plugin that is able to provide, support for those systems. So I think users that want to install on Ubuntu probably are most interested in the Debian plugin anyway.
Right, and we have the same exact limitation with Debian systems. The Debian systems
Yep.
going to have Pulp RPM installed on them.
Right. I would like us to try and fix that problem, because where you're running your Pulp server may have nothing to do with the kinds of clients you're trying to serve, that you're trying to get content to. So as long as we don't forget about this, would be a really good gap to close. But yeah, I think this is a great idea for all of the reasons that Mike lists here.
Yep, you're right. It is the content type that is correlated with the OS's package form manager. Like, I'm at a company where Ubuntu is the official standard.
Yep. Cool.
Any thoughts from Matthias, since he did a lot of work on our Debian support? He did work on our Debian support and Pulp Deb.
Yeah, well, it's a stretch to say if we support Debian, it's easy to support Ubuntu, but we should still pursue that.
Great. Okay, that sounds like we're all in agreement then.
Awesome.
They'll be added to the Pulp installer, agenda.
Sounds good, Mike.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that discussion. Our next topic is caching related. It says here, starts at line 88 on the miscellaneous agenda. It says related to downtime discussions. Rui needs. Who would like to speak to this item?
So I put this up here. So basically, we don't have much testing of Pulp under high load of content consumption, which means thousands of clients downloading content. We have a lot of tests of like testing Pulp under like sync load and publish, like tasking, but not so much on the consumption side, on the content app side. And that worries me because our content app makes at minimum one, but actually it's several database queries per request. So if you imagine, a couple thousand or maybe 15,000 clients making requests for, 50 packages, or a smaller number of machines making requests for a lot of packages, like a kickstart install, that adds up very, very quickly. It expands to millions of small database queries potentially. And I'm worried that our content app a bottleneck. And it's one that we have no insight into at what threshold it might become a problem. And we haven't really tested this because it's hard to test. It's really hard to test something like this, realistic load conditions, just by the nature. Like, we don't have 15,000 clients lying around. But I think we need to do something to, first of all, know if we have a problem here. And I think there's at least a moderate likelihood that we will. And if we do, then we need to come up with a way to address it. And the way it's related to the downtime discussion is, obviously if our content app is down, then no other clients can get content. And Rui had kind of the same concern where they wanted something on kind of like symlinks, like Pulp 2, where Nginx could keep serving content and metadata from the directories
without
even if the content app is down. That's where that kind of ties in.
Right, and having talked to some organizations like conferences, they want something like that too.
And are we trying to focus this discussion on technologies such as Squid or Varnish, or are we talking about actual functionality within Pulp that's going to provide this caching?
So what I learned from the Rui's folks testing is a couple things, and I'll start with the answer to that question. We likely cannot rely on any technology that uses in-memory caching. So I think, based on my understanding, that puts technologies like Squid off the table. I believe that also puts technologies like Memcache and Varnish off the table, which I think leads me to a conclusion that we will need to offer some sort of feature set, Pulp's feature set, that will provide a scalable, efficient cache like edge serving. And I use this term edge because even in Rui, for example, they have a distinction between the one type of node that you run as your primary, and then another type of node that you run as your on the edge. And I'll also call out that Artifactory has the same thing. Artifactory has two different types of nodes, and some of them are edge nodes for primarily for the big content-facing, client-facing part of the delivery. So, anyways, I would love to use one of those technologies because I always believe it's better to let a project dedicated to it do it. But unless it can do it on disk, I don't know how we'll be able to do that.
May I ask what type of caching this is? I mean, are we talking about caching the HTTP requests here, or would it work to cache the database accesses?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah, I'm making no proposal. I'm raising awareness that we need to look. First, we need to know how big of a problem do we have here. Like, at what point, like, are we going to fall over at 2,000 requests, or are we going to or 2,000 clients, or are we going to fall over at 20,000 clients?
Well, also there's a difference between if we fall over, no matter how many clients are hitting us, if we just fall over, that's a problem we have to solve, because you can't fall over. What you can do is have a bunch of those clients time out because they never get a response. The server has to keep processing. So I'd like to separate those as two different issues.
So I'd also like to separate an issue here. So on the one of the questions is, do we have an architectural problem? And let me just also preface this with saying, Daniel, I agree with you completely. It's in the interest of serving a solution to this problem that I'm trying to pick it apart. It's one thing to say we have an architectural problem and you cannot continue to scale Pulp to serve a client load at a certain size. It's another thing to say we have an architectural problem that has a latency problem. One's a throughput problem and the other is a latency problem. And the latency problem would sound more akin to clients cannot receive their content fast enough relative to their expectations or other systems or something like that. I don't believe we have the former. That is a throughput problem because most of these operations are read operations. And so you can deploy more web services, you can deploy more content apps, you can deploy more database nodes behind your Postgres installation. And so I don't think we have an architectural issue that would prevent throughput. I think the kind of not great part about the throughput problem is it's financially expensive. At some point, once your architecture allows never-ending scaling, what you realize is that the problem isn't that you can't scale it, it's that you can't afford to. And so I do believe that in the throughput area, we need to look at making our code more efficient some way or another. So I think there is a there. But what I heard from the Rui team was different. I actually think that the main problem that they're purporting and experiencing, which I agree with, is a real thing, is latency. Their observation was that without a caching layer, your RPM repo update for a single client, not a lot of them, a single one, latency, is like 14 seconds. And when they put some caching technology in the middle, and they drop that down to 3 seconds. And so these are the kinds of things that I'm hoping that we can pick apart.
Interesting.
Yep, and that goes to the point that Daniel made about the database queries, and that every time you request a package, we are querying it, and only after we get the answer from there do we serve a file. And this is where the caching, I think, would help, is once you've made that request to the database, providing some sort of caching. And the only thing I can think of now is just writing out a symlink that a web server can serve, which is what Pulp 2 did as the default publish method. And that is something that could be built into the content app. And it has a lot of caveats to it because, at some point you got to clean up those symlinks also. because things changed and the file shouldn't be there anymore. But we know that a web server is really good at looking at the file system and serving static assets.
I just want to point out though that,
and it doesn't use the memory.
I agree with everything you said. I just want to technically point out that the kernel, the reason web servers are so good at that is because they work with the kernel interfaces, which allow the kernel to provide maximally efficient binary data read and response. And what's kind of cool, what's very cool about white noise, which we use for our static media serving in the content app, is that it actually does the exact same thing. It does have to flow through one more hop, so I can't claim it's exactly as efficient, but the general notion that serving binary data through Python code is slow, actually, we don't have that problem. So I think when I hear the concerns, I mainly focus on the DB query expense.
Oh, totally.
And
totally.
And maybe we'll end up doing both. I think actually the idea of the symlinking and pushing that to an edge kind of a deployment would be very good. I also think that you should be able to use your regular Pulp node and just make it very, very much faster through the use of DB query caching.
Interesting. In terms of testing this, because that was the other half of the question I heard Daniel asking, which is how can we put load on Pulp more easily from our end of things to try and flush out where the problem states are. I know that Red Hat's QE has or had tooling in place back in the day where you could spin up a container and that container would essentially mimic some number of thousands of either RHEL, CentOS, or Fedora clients. They basically implemented the DNF to the host, you ask for a thing and get it back communication. So it's one container. You still need a big machine to run these things on, obviously, if you want to pretend to be 100,000 systems. But there's infrastructure that we can probably dig up. I don't know where that is right now, but I know it has existed and was in heavy use in the past. So that might give us a leg up on being able to say, I'd like to pretend to be 10,000 clients all asking for content from Pulp without needing 10,000 VMs somewhere to make that happen.
If we could,
because you don't need an actual system, you just need a piece of software. You need a process that pretends to be a machine.
Yep.
If we could find that, that would be excellent.
Yeah, and
I will.
And the other, I have.
Go ahead, Brian.
Well, I just want to counterpoint that we've been doing a lot of our scale testing on Amazon boxes themselves, and I think that pattern has been working really, really well. So if there's some piece of software that we could use to test it, I think that would be great. I think I'm a little hesitant to rely on the infrastructure that we had used in the past because we're responsible for testing so much these days.
Yep. Well, I don't think anybody's talking about using some other infrastructure. It's a matter of getting the right software to do the testing with.
That sounds great.
Yep, because we definitely already do testing on big boxes, and we want to continue doing that testing in those same environments.
I'm also seeing some links here in the chat of some things that we could use as well. And I've also used a project in the past called Sung. Let me look that up.
I mean, what I'm hearing in response, and so this, Daniel, pardon me if I'm wrong, but you kind of drove this question, but what I'm hearing is a lot of support, that everybody agrees this is something that we need to address. And it's important. It's important for Pulp. It's important for our users. And it's important for using Pulp at scale where the whole industry is going at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think what would be really killer would be some testing and graphing of those tests and really having, I think there are the two graphs that are critical to produce. One is kind of akin to the C10K problem, which is what's the response time average response time for 1,000 clients? What's the average response time for 10,000 clients and 50 and then 100,000 clients, and show that graph. and then maybe try to make the system actually larger, like double its resources or quadruple its resources and quadruple its load, and see if you can maintain a similar performance response time. And then the other graph would be a single query's latency. It's a latency analysis. It uses a single query, a single client, and it looks at different hardware sizes of the content app, the database, and the Apache server, and tries to look at the relationship between a single query's latency and those various sizes. And I suspect, I'm going to guess here, but I suspect or hypothesize what I think we'll find in the latency area is that it's pretty slow relative to what we would need to do to have great latency performance, and that no amount of extra hardware makes it faster. And that if you want to make it faster, then what we can do is we can look at caching or the sim linking option and then rerun the test, and I think we'll see, oh man, the latency dropped significantly. And I kind of feel like this is what the Rui team has been demonstrating, only this would be like a more sciencey way of doing it.
Yeah. And I would love for us to, publish all these graphs on our blog.
Yeah. And just to point out one minor thing, also in our content app, even though it's nominally async, we're running synchronous IO in the asynchronous coroutines, which basically means we're not getting much out of async. So I think it's possible that the latency and the throughput might.
Yeah, I just want to confirm, are you referring to the Postgres driver that we're using to do the database?
I'm referring to the Django ORM as an async it blocks.
Yeah.
We're blocking inside our coroutines.
Yep.
Yeah, and and there may be something that we could do, but I agree with you completely, Daniel. And there may be something that we could do about that as well. It's difficult to make a large code base async capable around its queries. The content app is like 100 lines long, and I do believe that we could probably do something in that area as well to make it async.
Yeah, we're going to write raw SQL queries.
No, we're going to use what Django's already planning to do. Actually, if we're going to write raw SQL queries, I think Grant will do it.
I mean, you're not wrong.
I'm just kidding.
So, I mean, honestly, the actual answer here is just use threads.
That's fine.
Yep.
I mean, if we're at the point of just serving the content, there's really nothing that needs to be hitting database queries. I mean, you have an authentication layer, but that can be external. I mean, to some degree of varying levels of complexity, cough, RHS, and but aside from that, you get to a certain point, it's like just put it on the CDN.
Yeah, it's true, and that's the other option as well. Is that you can configure Django storages, which Pulp uses for its storage system, and it supports both CDNs and pull through cache CDNs, which is a different kind of a CDN. So yeah, I agree, Adrian, and we should be trying to consider that as well.
Yep, I was just about to say, I was just researching how Quay is always deployed. It's always deployed via, on top of Kubernetes, and they can scale their Quay pods and presumably database pods up and down, but they also use object storage all the time, it looks like. That's how they perform their scalability. They don't need a caching layer at all because of object storage.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the throughput architectural stuff, and what I wonder about is what's the latency analysis? What's the latency of a single request?
Right, because it has to it still has to hit the content server in the database.
Yeah, or not if we had some better offering in this area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would be the trick, is not hit the content server or the database.
Right.
Then it's easy. aside from generating randomly mutating static content, which is hard.
Yeah, and just to call it out, like, why did the architecture change from Pulp 2 since we didn't exactly have this problem in Pulp 2? And one of the reasons is that when you publish so much content onto a single file system, a lot of file systems have symlink limits. And we ran into this problem a lot in Pulp 2. And so on the one hand, it's like, well, just why are you doing it differently? Just do it like everybody else does and just put it on the file system and let the web server serve it. Yeah, that creates a different kind of problem too. And so I think that I just wanted to call that out because that's a related issue that we did not actually talk about.
So cool. Are there any sort of next steps we want to take?
I think the next steps would be to find that tooling that QE has and plan some analysis and do some analysis.
Cool.
That sounds
Well, I would
super
also
great.
say figure out what skill you actually care about. Because clearly, you're not going to care about scaling 1 million requests a second, but you probably do care about 1,000. Or whatever, pick your metric. But yeah, at some point, it's just like no, you're not a customer anymore. Do something else. It's not worth the effort.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree.
Daniel, I'll do some digging. Remind me next week, because I've got to go through like 6-year-old email to figure out who to talk to. But I'll see if I can't dig up who was involved in that, and we can start pursuing down those rabbit holes.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's excellent. So that's probably a good transition into a little bit of kind of action items, or at least even soft action items around it. So Daniel and Grant, sounds like you guys will collaborate on this to get us started. And Mike, going back to the Ubuntu and supporting the installer, sounds like you will handle starting that effort, at least writing a ticket and putting it on the installer meeting and such.
Yep. Exactly.
Cool. Does that sound, Daniel, did this section serve your interests and needs as the person who put the content onto it?
Yes.
I think this is a really important thing. I'm really glad that you brought this up. All right, well then let's go on to our last topic, which is releasing Y releases with or without, I say without, but let's say with or without a delay to allow for manual testing. And we had talked some about this on several threads on the mailing list. And I was observing that there are kind of two schools of thought in this area, and actually I think they're both valid, but I just wanted to put these out there and then see if we can just have a little bit of discussion, just even not even to make a decision. I actually think every release will likely be different based on what's going in, what still needs to go in, and what our tolerance is to deliver later. Some releases we just may not be able to because someone needs it by this date, so forth. But I want to just kind of see where folks are at and to have just open, unbiased sharing of perspectives on it. So one of the camps or beliefs, I guess, is that we have I guess this is mine. We have automated tests, and so you don't get what you don't test. And after we merge things, there isn't a benefit in having a delay before a Y release, which tends to be bigger. Z streams are very small, so this is really about Y releases. There isn't a benefit to delay because the automated tests ran, and we're not adding more tests in that time, and automated testing is our strategy. We used to have a manual testing strategy, but we don't do that anymore. So that's the motivation for releasing right after the last feature is merged. To state what I've heard from another perspective, which I actually think is probably equally valid, to be fair, is that there's a benefit to a baking period after the bid features are merged. And you can also think of this as a testing period, and this is why people put out things like release candidates. It's an opportunity for other developers and in many cases users to test the upcoming Y release and give feedback on its quality. And the concern is that if we release too quickly, just after merging something large, as we did, for example, in 3.6, then we will not be releasing with quality. And we could get that quality if we have some sort of a feature freeze or delay in release. So I'll just leave it at that's what I've heard. What are your thoughts on this matter?
Can someone remind me what, because I know this part of what drove this was we released 3.6 and then had to release a 3.6.1 really quickly because something happened and I can't remember what it was because my brain is mush. Does somebody remember what that sequence was with the 3.6 release?
I think I remember, correct me otherwise. We definitely had to release some Z streams, 3.6.1, 3.6.2, 3.6.3 very quickly thereafter. The 3.6.3 was a long-standing regression that was present even in 3.5 and earlier. And until someone actually tested it and they just happened to do it then, we didn't know about it. So that one I don't think we would have benefited from. The other two came from, or at least 3.6.1 came from testing a Pulp lift box that included the Pulp 2, Pulp 3, or CentOS box. And I believe that another developer used that, and so if we had waited a day or two, we would have found that problem. But to argue the other side of it, if there's a box that we know that we need, then it should be in the automated testing. And if it wasn't the automated testing, we wouldn't have had that happen to start with.
So as a person who kind of in a support for having a baking period, I can share my perspective that I completely agree that in ideal world, our goal is what you prefer, Brian. And I'm not sure how to assess this properly, like this situation, but I think there should be a certain level of test coverage when we can be sure that we can rely on it to release. And I don't think we're there yet.
So I don't disagree, Tanya. My concern here with, well, we'll wait and have a baking period, is if during that baking period, anything different than we did right before we cut the release, then we won't find, we'll do the baking period, but we're not learning anything new. Like in this particular, in the 3.6.1 instance, if nobody had been using that particular box, we would not have found the bug. And if there had been a baking period, we still wouldn't have found the bug because nobody was using that particular scenario. Can we come up with, are there a set of things that we don't automate right now that we could do during this baking period? Short term. Long term, the answer is the answer to that is yes, we need automated tests for that. We need to make that list smaller and smaller over time so that we can get to this point. I'm 50-50 as to whether we're there yet. I think there's important things that we don't have automated tests for yet, although I can't name any off the top of my head because there's a flamingo on it, so I can't. But I think what I think, and I'm just kind of struggling here with where I'm trying to get with this. I guess what I'd like to see is what are the kinds of things we want to do during a bake-in period that will make it useful at finding stuff before we unleash a release onto our meeting.
I've got a really good idea, because actually this just happened to me yesterday. Because one of the things I was imagining during this baking period, like one of the things we could do is focus on docs and have docs day during this baking period. Yesterday I was working on docs and I found 2 bugs while working on docs, and I just opened up PRs for it. So I think that would be really helpful if we do decide to have a baking period.
I just want to remind that the idea was to have a feature freeze. So not to release, like we merge feature and then we release like the same day or next day, because we usually like, it's so important, we need to put this into this release and so on. But if we have, I don't know, 3 days or like 1 week, we're closing other bugs. Like David said, we're working on docs. We discussed that we'll have docs day at this point. We can maybe write more tests. We have a huge backlog for testing. And at the same time, I believe some of our stakeholders, they use nightlists. So we all use different bits and pieces throughout this week for a certain period of time, even if not a single user installs this release out there. That was the main motivation. Definitely do something and not just wait.
Yep. So my main concern overall isn't a blocking one in this case. I'm just calling it out just so it's out there, is that I want to avoid a situation where we start doing manual testing. And no one's proposing that, so I'm just going to put that out there. The challenging part about, so what you're saying, Tanya and David, I like, because what you're saying is that during this, it's a productive period where we're going to take action to get more than we got before. Because one of my main beliefs is that if we run the automated tests and we don't do anything during the baking period, then we're not benefiting from it. But what you're saying sounds like pretty good. I want to call out a paradox though that's present in this plan, and I don't know what to do about it, and that's the only reason I'm saying it. So Pulp tends to be under the gun, right? Because someone needs something and they need it now. So it becomes difficult for us to justify that we haven't released something. Why? Because we're waiting. That's when days matter, and sometimes even cases hours matter. That becomes a difficult thing. And so what ends up happening is, and here's the paradox, we're under the gun to deliver something, and so we're working like crazy to finish that last feature, and yet the stakeholder can't afford a delay. And so here's the paradox is, so the solution to that is that I need to deliver my feature earlier. Oh wait, I'm already working like mad to deliver it. We've just made a hard problem worse. I don't know what to do about that.
I will give you a counter argument to this paradox.
Good.
So I hear on that we are under the gun. However, once we release without having this baking period, there is a really high chance that there will be bugs there, right? So even if you give this release to the stakeholder who is on fire, there is a higher chance that it will be unusable. As a consequence, we'll need to spend more FTs from our side to make another zero-release SAP. How many times we've been in this boat? A lot lately. So as a counter-argument, like waiting, I don't know, I don't want to say specific days, but let's say a couple of days where we call them as a feature freeze. And meanwhile, we'll work on docs. And as David mentioned, like he discovered those bugs. And if it's an easy fix, we'll manage to get them into the release. In this way, we'll decrease these chances of delivering super buggy release just because we managed to smuggle in the latest feature and release right after.
Yeah, also, like, what does it mean when the stakeholder needs the release? Like, if we do a beta release at the beginning of the baking period, can they start to use that and test it out before we do the actual release, and then they would have a higher quality release?
And I think I agree. That's a great question. And so I don't believe that the answer is that they can, but don't take my word for it. One of the drivers for the September 22nd delivery, which is a date we agreed on a long time ago, but a lot of people have built their schedules and workflows around that date, right? and we couldn't deliver the features that need to go in it any sooner. So I don't think we could have the baking period start any sooner. So that puts us up against under the gun again. So the question for Galaxy NG, for example, I see David Nussweiner and Adrian on the call. Kind of two questions. Is delaying, what would a delay in if we didn't deliver Pulp Core 3.7 on September 22nd and we delivered it 3 days or a week later, how would that affect you? And the other question would be, if we said that we were feature complete and had a nightly, would you use it in that period?
Well, specifically for the September 22 release, if that was delayed a week, we'd probably have to push back our RC release. But I think it would be useful to have nightly build and some time to test things out before they're released. We have had trouble with some of the things that Ina is mentioning, where we get a release and it's fairly buggy, and we then have to come back to you guys and put more pressure on you guys and work around the bugs and stuff like that. So, yeah.
So what I wonder is, what difference does it make calling something 3.7.0 GA and calling it a 3.7.0 release candidate or beta? And is there a difference? Because I feel like as a user of software, whenever I see a .0 release, I expect bugs in it. And I expect to have to upgrade to the .1, .2, whatever comes out later. And I'm conflicted myself as to, do we do these, release candidate or beta releases, or do we just release a .0 knowing that we will need to release a Z-Stream after?
I think it mostly just depends on if there's tooling that's going to update to 3.7.0 automatically. If there is, yeah, maybe need to be a little more careful. But if it's not, and no one's doing that, yeah, then it's pretty meaningless distinction.
Dennis, I think as our tooling for doing the Z releases gets more and more automatic and takes less and less time, because part of that discussion is, okay, we release 3.x and then we release an x.1, .2, .3, .4 over the course of the next 3 days. Do you really want to cut 4 more releases over 3 days right now today? Probably not, just from our own sanity's sake. But if I could cut a new release by simply pushing a button somewhere and having 90% of the release processing happen automatically, then it becomes a lot easier for us to say, we're going to fix it and you'll get a new one. And it'll happen 4 hours after the last one. And I don't feel like I'm stressed or that I'm requiring somebody else on the team to be horribly stressed to try and get that out. I will say that the last minute, oh my God, this thing that you thought you had more time for actually has to come in a week or a month earlier, or you thought you had everything done, but we just gave you a bunch of new requirements, but you can't move the date. Those are anti-patterns, and I know we're always going to have them, but I would hesitate to drive our entire release process on that. And because that we need to, as a team, for the quality of the product and the sanity of not just us, but our stakeholders, have to be able to push back on, look, you've got to think in advance, because you don't want what happens. You, our stakeholders, do not want what happens when we try and put a major new feature into place in 3 days. Trust me. So I'll just throw that out there.
I would like to comment on what Dennis said earlier, sharing my perception about the RC beta in GA. Like, when I look at those tags, I definitely expect bugs for RC, less for RC, more for beta. But if it's a GA, I have an expectation that if I install that build, it's ready for production. And in case we decide to go down that path, then I'm pretty sure we'll need to adopt all the freeze and all the freezes milestones, which will be part of the release process.
So, in a way, my beliefs on this matter come down to a different question. And the question that I keep asking myself is, if we had a baking period, would people actually test it? And if the answer to that is yes, then I would say I'm in favor of it. If the answer to that is no, then I think I'm not in favor of it. And so, because we know more testing results in better software. So really the goal should, it's not even necessarily about a baking period. I think it's what are our strategies to have our software more tested and better tested earlier. And that brings me to another point, which is if we're unsure of features that we're committing, then we're not providing adequate testing for that feature. And we would do better, and our users and stakeholders would do better to have fewer features that were more high quality delivered with tests. And we shouldn't be merging things that we're unsure of. And we shouldn't probably be releasing features that we're not testing.
Well, if it's not tested, in my mind, if it's not tested, it's not a feature. Like, we can't promise that we have a feature if we're not testing it.
Well, we do test it to a certain extent while we review the PRs, while we write the docs, if we write them in a timely manner.
Yeah, but basically, I think, Douglas, please.
I was just going to ask, is there a difference between new features being introduced and breakage of existing features, and taking a slightly different tack where new features were introduced, but a bit like RHEL does with IPA when it was originally introduced as a tech preview? You introduce something as a tech preview for those that are very keen to adopt it, and they can adopt it. But it is with the notion that it's a tech preview. My concern would be any new feature that broke existing functionality, making it into a GA. I know personally, I'm with you on, I always expect a .1, .2, .3, and when you're in production, you tend not to adopt something until it hits a .1, .2, .3, just as I would never go to Red Hat 8 until it's 8.1 or 8.2. It's just the nature of the beast. So is there a difference between new features, which could be considered tech preview, vs breakage of existing functionality?
Yeah.
Yep.
That's a really useful separation. Thanks.
So I just want to call a time check. So we have just a few more minutes. Justin, please.
Sure. Yeah, you were talking about. Sorry, I came in kind of late. We were talking about, I think, betas and whether anyone would be able to test them. I think from the Catellar side, we could definitely commit to a certain level of testing, which would most likely just catch, regressions with things. We tend to hit those a lot with the bindings or other kind of obscure areas. I think that if a beta was released, we could definitely do a certain level of testing, which would basically be upgrading like our dev workstation and running those integration tests. We definitely have a harder time when it comes to running the full nightly pipelines that we have, because those tend to require RPM builds and are a lot more difficult to do that with. But I would definitely like to see us improve our ability to test prior to a release, so that we don't hit things where we have to have immediate Z streams to fix bindings that have been broken. Ideally, we would be testing nightlies or on a nightly basis, but it's just really hard due to the fact that our existing nightlies, run from RPMs.
And Justin, I think you're basically calling out the name of the game, which is, I don't think this debate, while it's interesting about whether we change our process or not, I think it's significantly more productive to focus on making sure that as many people are testing our software as they can. And if we, I think, are purposeful and intentional about making sure that nightly, literally every night, that they're somehow upgraded into the Cattell environment, and to the extent that we can run the full pipeline on it, that would be excellent. And similarly for Galaxy and G. I tell people that they should have their CI use master, and that way before we release they know what they're getting. That's not practical in a lot of cases, and so don't do it. But the strategy is the same, which is more testing earlier produces better software.
Yep. I think we're pretty much at our time.
Yes, I agree.
For this discussion.
I'd like to have a quick comment about the being under the gun and all these things. Just to remind you that all these discussions started also with regards to stress levels in everyone. And I kind of encourage people not to forget about it, especially at current times. And I think working with the projects which rely on us is a partnership. So we kind of need to agree how we collaborate so no one is under the gun. They're willing to test early, and we try to deliver, I don't know, plan dates better. And it's very often that something urgent happens, but if it becomes on a regular basis, there is something wrong and it needs to be changed.
Very well said, Tanya. I agree. Is it time for the closing ceremony?
I believe it is time for the closing ceremonies.
As traditional among our people at PulpCon.
Yes.
On Friday at PulpCon.
On Friday at PulpCon. I don't know. Is this able to be heard? I don't know. I bet it will be.
Are you sharing? Do you want to share your screen?
I don't know. Is this working? How about now? Is it working now?
No, I'm not hearing whatever you're trying to I'll tell you what, you might have to put it on your phone.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Well, we'll try that, and that'll be fine. We'll try that here in a minute.
This would not be a tech meeting, video meeting, without there being a tech problem. It's what happens. So
I agree.
Also, if you're streaming this to YouTube, be aware you may get a copyright claim.
Yeah, that's no problem. We'll take that hit.
Well, we're not trying to monetize, so I think we're okay.
Yeah, we can just take it down. It's fine. For everyone who wants to watch it, that is our Friday song. And maybe this will work.
Yes! Yes. Why microphone no distortion filter.
Yeah. Yes, that is our Friday song. We should take this time to call out the survey. Where's the link to the survey?
I'll get it.
Yeah, so here in the chat, if you liked PulpCon or if you have anything that you'd like to see differently next year, please put your feedback in the survey. That would be really, really great. It's the retro. I'm sorry, it's not a survey.
The retrospective is here. Mel, if you have anybody who hasn't responded to it can give you more data.
Yes. Yes. So put your feedback in there. I also wanted to, since these closing ceremonies are sponsored by Rebecca Black and the Friday Song, I wanted to share a little fun thing that I made, which is a fork of the Black Project, but only it's called Rebecca Black. And as you can see from the README, when you run Black, it prints out Rebecca Black lyrics for you. And I just wanted to give a quick demonstration as
Share
we
your screen.
close.
Do we have a plugin that supports Black OS at all?
Not yet, bro.
All right, I think this should be working. Yeah, so if you
Zoom
use this
in.
software, can you all see this?
No, zoom in.
Can you see this?
All right. Yeah.
There we go.
All right, so this is the checkout of Rebecca Black, and when you run Black, it prints out lyrics on the T2.
Fun, fun, fun.
No, fun.
Nice.
I love it.
So yeah, you can try that. I'll be sure to keep it up to date. It does pass in the CI.
That's the most important part.
Definitely. It only took me 3 commits to get it right.
We should adjust the cron job schedule or some other means so that it uses this version on Friday.
Yes, I hope that it receives wide adoption.
So I want to propose, given Brian's dedication to all things in this context, that Brian and Rebecca Black to come to PulpCon next year on Friday.
Good luck.
I think that's an excellent idea, Grant, and I appreciate your suggestion.
I will even volunteer to help you wordsmith the email if you want to do it.
Wonderful. That sounds
All right,
really
we'll try to find her manager.
Yes.
And if you need to throw in a Pulp shirt to like sweeten the deal, we can do this.
Definitely. That's all right.
I mean, that poor girl has gotten so much grief for that. At least she can do is get a Pulp T-shirt out of it, right?
Yes.
Exactly. It makes all things just a little bit better. So
I mean, girl, what is she now? In her late 20s or 30 or something like that this year?
No idea. All I know is the Friday.
All y'all look like I'm just saying.
She's timeless. I don't know. Yeah.
That's right.
She's
timeless.
23 only. God love her. 23.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh wow! So I just want to say now that we've heard our traditional closing here, I don't know about you all, but this has been really good. I've really appreciated the talks. I've really appreciated having more folk that aren't actively named the Pulp team involved and giving us feedback. This has been outstanding. Thank everybody so much for all the week.
I agree. This has been
Agreed.
amazing. I've really enjoyed the format. I feel like we got a lot out of it. I had some hesitations going into this week, and I wasn't sure how a fully virtual format would go, but it's been amazing and definitely lived up to all the expectations. And I hope that we can do more of this throughout the year, not necessarily like 5 days in a row or something like that, but just getting together on a video call with our community and getting feedback. I think it would be very beneficial to do that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know, everyone. I think it went really well, and it feels like it was much more inclusive because we were forced to do it online. And for all the hat lovers, I wish everyone to keep a cool head.
There are definitely advantages from the situation we are in 2020. This allowed other people to join because they saved all the travels. So thank you everyone who managed to join and spend some time with us.
And so concludes PulpCon.
Woo!
We did it, everybody. I'm ending the recording.
YouTube, the recording's already done.
I'm ending the stream.